This is a special edition of Macro Voices, the premier financial podcast targeting professional finance, high net worth individuals, family offices, and other sophisticated investors. Now, for this special edition of Macro Voices, here's Eric Townsend.
I'm Eric Townsend, and this is the introduction for the preview of the audio track only for the fourth episode of my formative docuseries project about the coming mid-2020s global energy crisis. Now, if you were looking for the regular weekly Macro Voices podcast, which is about investing in macroeconomics and which features co-host Patrick Ceresna, this ain't it. Regular Macro Voices episodes have 3-digit episode numbers, and this is a special episode, not one of our regular episodes, and it's about a documentary series project, or actually a preview of a documentary series project that I'm working on. Okay, just had to clear that one up since we had some feedback that people were stumbling into these special docuseries preview episodes without any context and getting confused. Thanks, everyone, for your feedback on the first 3 episodes. I am hard at work on a total rewrite of episode number 1 that will take a completely different approach based on your feedback and critique. Assuming that there's audience interest, our tentative plan is to continue with episode number 4 this week, then episode number 5 next week, and then hopefully by a week after that, or if not another week after that, we'll try to get it out as quickly as we can, but we will then air a preview of a completely new and improved episode 1, which was rewritten based on the feedback and critique received from you, the Macro Voices review community. This week's episode number 4 is the first of 2 episodes making the argument that the very best option before us and the only option that we can be certain is scalable to fully replace fossil fuels by 2050 is nuclear energy. Now, the reason I waited until the final 2 episodes to introduce nuclear as my favored solution is that I know the climate community has already been evangelized with misguided propaganda telling them that nuclear energy is bad. That's also the reason that I've taken the approach in today's episode of focusing first on the legitimate problems that really do still exist with the nuclear industry. I'm trying to show the audience that I'm not going to bullshit them and I'm not going to sugarcoat the real issues that still exist with nuclear energy. I want to show them that I'm being truthful about both the good and the bad news about nuclear before getting into my arguments as to why I'm convinced that it's the only viable solution to the challenges that we face. So I really hope you'll enjoy this episode, even though you've already heard a lot about nuclear energy in recent Macro Voices episodes. I think you'll find this episode and next week's episode, number 5, will go much deeper into the history, challenges, and opportunities that exist for nuclear energy. Episode 4, What's Wrong with Nuclear Energy? I'm Eric Townsend. In earlier episodes of this docuseries, I explained the critical role energy plays in determining our quality of life and the pace of advancement of the human race. Next, I explained why a global energy crisis is imminent and can no longer be avoided. Then, in the episode before this one, I explained that I'm only aware of 2 realistic solutions to the crisis, and went on to explain the first of those 2 options in detail, deep supercritical geothermal energy. I've intentionally waited until now to tell you the very best option before us is the one I know some of you already vehemently oppose. That's right, I'm talking about nuclear energy. But please don't jump to the conclusion that I'm a fan of the current generation of uranium-fueled pressurized light water reactors, like the ones that melted down at Fukushima Daiichi. Quite to the contrary, I think the nuclear power industry has some significant problems to overcome, and my concerns go well beyond the usual objections about meltdowns, nuclear waste disposal, and weapons proliferation. So I'll start with a short tutorial on how nuclear energy generation works and then focus most of this episode on what's wrong with the current generation of nuclear power plants. The overarching theme is that there's really nothing inherently unsafe or wrong with nuclear power. The problem is that governments tightly control and regulate the nuclear power industry, and until very recently, they did an atrocious job of protecting the interests of we the people from corruption, greed, and horrendous policy errors caused by political favoritism. I'll expose some of those violations of public trust in this episode. Unless we can achieve some really big breakthroughs in deep supercritical geothermal energy technology and achieve them very quickly, there simply isn't any alternative to nuclear that can generate clean electricity on the scale we're going to need it to solve this crisis. Nuclear energy most assuredly can scale up to produce 180,000 terawatt-hours of new, clean, safe energy by 2050, but doing so will require a complete reversal of public policy. And then it will take at least a full decade to build out all the nuclear power plants we're going to need. Nuclear power is already the cleanest and safest source of baseload energy by any objective measure. But similar to aviation, although the accidents are extremely few and far between, they always make front-page news. Far more people are killed by drunk drivers every single year than the total number of passengers killed in airline accidents in all of aviation history. But the crash site photos after an airline mishap are so graphic and gut-wrenching that we never forget them. Drunk driving fatalities seldom make the nightly news. By any objective measure, the number of accidents, deaths, and diseases, including cancer, is far lower per gigawatt hour of energy produced from nuclear than from any other baseload energy source. But the extremely rare events where something goes badly wrong in a nuclear power plant are so sensational that we never forget them. Many nuclear advocates will tell you that's reason enough to stop worrying about safety and get behind nuclear energy. Sorry, but personally, I still have reservations. They're right that nuclear power is already safer than any other form of power generation. But the accidents at Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima all could have and should have been prevented. Those accidents didn't happen because nuclear power is inherently dangerous or unsafe. They all happened because human beings did astonishing stupid things that resulted in horrific outcomes. Regulators have created a mountain of bureaucracy and red tape around all things nuclear that pushes the price of nuclear energy much higher than it needs to be. But all that regulation failed to prevent accidents that were easily preventable. We don't need more regulation of nuclear energy. We need smarter, more effective regulation in place of bureaucracy and red tape, which is currently standing in the way of both progress and safety. Much better and safer reactors were designed, tested, and proven decades ago. They produce much less waste, and it only needs to be stored for a few hundred years as opposed to 100,000 years for the waste produced by current-generation nuclear reactors. I promised in the first episode to tell you the truth about the full extent of the challenges we face. So before moving on to the latest nuclear technology, let's take a look at what's wrong with the current generation of nuclear power plants. There are several different reactor designs, but for the sake of brevity, I'm going to focus on the most common type used in nuclear power plants in service today and currently under construction: the pressurized light water reactor fueled by uranium. A nuclear reactor works by harnessing the heat energy released from a sustained nuclear fission chain reaction. The core of the reactor contains fuel rods made of low-enriched uranium. For our purposes, all you really need to know about the nuclear physics involved is that there are a bunch of neutrons flying around, and they're moving too fast. To make the nuclear fission reaction sustainable, it's necessary to slow those neutrons down. This is accomplished by filling the reactor core with water. The water serves two main purposes. The first is to slow down the neutrons flying around between the fuel rods. The water is called the moderator because it moderates the speed of those neutrons. The second purpose the water serves is to absorb the heat energy being released by the nuclear fission reaction occurring between the fuel rods. That means the water gets really hot really quickly, so it has to be continuously circulated out of the core into a heat exchanger, where the heat can be removed and used to produce steam to turn a turbine and generate electricity. Nuclear reactors are so good at heating water quickly that most of the problems arise only when the heat can't be removed quickly enough. To shut down the nuclear fission reaction, control rods are inserted into the core. The purpose of the control rods is to absorb the neutrons flying around inside the core, which are essential to sustaining the nuclear fission reaction. With the control rods fully inserted, the nuclear fission reaction will completely stop. 94% of the heat being generated in the fuel rods will stop instantly when the control rods are inserted and the nuclear fission chain reaction stops. But the remaining 6% of heat generated by the fuel rods is known as decay heat, and it doesn't just switch off instantly like a light switch. It takes quite a while after the control rods are inserted before the fuel rods stop producing decay heat, so it's critically important to keep removing heat from the coolant water to prevent the core from overheating. That's why coolant circulation pumps are essential to reactor safety. If the circulation pumps stop working, the water in the core can overheat and boil off. If that happens, even though the nuclear fission chain reaction has already stopped, the fuel rods are still making so much decay heat that they can melt and burn through the bottom of the core chamber. That's the so-called nuclear meltdown scenario you hear so much about in Hollywood movies. And that's exactly what happened at Fukushima Daiichi. When the earthquake hit, seismic sensors were triggered, and the reactors shut down automatically. All that was necessary to prevent disaster was to keep the circulation pumps running to cool the fuel rods in the core, and everything would have been fine. Once the reactors shut down, the electricity produced by the nuclear plant was offline, but the pumps could run on electricity from the power grid. And just in case the power grid failed, which it did, there were diesel backup generators installed specifically to cover this exact scenario. The backup generators were supposed to provide electricity to run the circulation pumps, even after the electricity from the power grid was cut off. But when the tsunami hit, everything was flooded, including the backup generators. The circulation pumps shut down, the cores overheated and eventually melted down, and the rest is history. I want you to remember one very important detail about how this type of nuclear reactor works. The moderator used to slow the neutrons down, which also serves as the coolant used to remove heat from the core, is ordinary water. In the nuclear industry, it's called light water to distinguish it from a special kind of water known as heavy water, which I'll explain in the next episode. The vast majority of nuclear reactors in commercial use for producing electricity are moderated and cooled by light water. And as we'll see, that leads to quite a few problems. The light water inside the core circulates through a heat exchanger so that the heat produced by the nuclear fission chain reaction can be used to boil a separate source of water into steam that drives a turbine to generate electricity. The amount of energy the reactor can produce, and thus the amount of electricity it can generate, depends primarily on how hot the water in the core can get. Ordinary light water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. In theory, you could operate a nuclear reactor with water that never gets hotter than 100 Celsius, but if your goal is to run an electric power plant, that's not nearly enough. To get the most out of the nuclear fission reaction and produce enough electricity to power the grid, you need to get the water up to several hundred degrees Celsius. At normal atmospheric pressure, water just can't get that hot. It boils to steam at 100 Celsius. The solution that's used by most light water reactor designs is to pressurize the water in the core. Just as a pressure cooker makes it possible to heat food in liquid form to more than 100 degrees Celsius without boiling, a pressurized core allows the coolant water to be heated to several hundred degrees Celsius, allowing much more energy from the nuclear fission reaction to be harnessed to generate electricity. This requires pressurizing the core to about 150 times atmospheric pressure, or about 2200 psi in a typical pressurized light water reactor design. But as any engineer in almost any field will tell you, anytime you build any machine that operates under such high pressure, there's always a risk that a failure could occur, and that all that pressure will suddenly be released. If that happens to water that's been heated to several hundred degrees Celsius, the water will flash to steam instantly. And that's the whole reason that such large containment buildings are needed for relatively small nuclear reactor cores. If something breaks and the water in the core depressurizes, it will instantly flash to radioactive steam. One of the primary purposes of the containment building is to prevent the radioactive steam from escaping into the atmosphere. I know that sounds pretty scary, right? Well, hold on, it gets worse. The risk of the water in the core flashing to radioactive steam if the core depressurizes is just one of the inherent shortcomings of using light water as the coolant. To understand the next one, we need to recall the chemical formula for water, which everyone knows, H2O. In other words, every water molecule consists of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. Hydrogen is the extremely flammable gas that the Hindenburg was filled with. And oxygen is the stuff that makes everything burn faster and hotter. The combination of pure hydrogen and pure oxygen is an explosive mixture you could literally make a bomb with. Yet water, which is made from hydrogen and oxygen atoms, is what we use to put fires out with. Please ask yourself how that's even possible. The answer is that the hydrogen and oxygen atoms in every molecule of water are bound together so strongly that they can't be separated without consuming a huge amount of energy. It's what scientists call a covalent bond, and it holds those hydrogen and oxygen atoms together in a way that makes them perfectly safe. In almost any normal everyday situation, there's no risk whatsoever that water could separate into the incredibly dangerous combination of pure hydrogen gas and pure oxygen gas because it takes so much energy to break those covalent bonds holding the water molecules together that nothing short of the neutron bombardment from a sustained nuclear fission reaction could ever break them apart. Newsflash! Guess what's going on inside a nuclear reactor core? You guessed it, a sustained nuclear fission reaction, which could, if things go wrong, break those covalent bonds in the light water, causing it to separate into the incredibly dangerous combination of pure hydrogen gas and pure oxygen gas, which could explode and blow the roof off. And to be clear, I'm not using the phrase blow the roof off figuratively. That's exactly what happened at Fukushima Daiichi. Here's the video of a hydrogen explosion literally blowing the roof off the containment building after the circulation pumps failed, and the reactor core melted down, separating some of the coolant water from the core into an explosive mix of hydrogen and oxygen. Are you getting the picture now why I'm not the biggest fan of light water as a nuclear reactor core coolant when better choices have been available for decades? The alternative coolants don't separate into explosive gases if the core melts down, and they have other benefits too. What if I told you that another coolant called molten salt has already been tested and proven to work in a nuclear reactor with no need for any pressurization whatsoever? And what if I told you that it could operate at temperatures up to 700 degrees Celsius, removing heat from the nuclear fission chain reaction even better than pressurized light water, and without any risk of depressurizing or flashing to steam because nothing needs to be pressurized to start with? I'll bet you're thinking this molten salt stuff must be the latest and greatest 21st century invention, since clearly it seems like a much smarter way to build a nuclear reactor. Surely we wouldn't be using light water as the coolant in our commercial reactor fleet if we'd known about this molten salt stuff back in the 1970s when we started building the reactors in service today, right? Sorry, wrong answer. Molten salt-cooled nuclear reactors were designed, built, tested, and proven to work in the mid-1960s. And I don't just mean on a drawing board. The molten salt reactor experiment at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory built and operated molten salt-cooled nuclear reactors in the mid-1960s. And they worked beautifully, completely eliminating the need for a water coolant susceptible to hydrogen separation and eliminating the need to pressurize the reactor core. But wait, it gets better. The Molten Salt Project at Oak Ridge also perfected a new reactor design that completely eliminated meltdown risk by dissolving the fuel in the molten salt coolant so that there are no fuel rods. In the liquid-fueled molten salt reactor designed at Oak Ridge, the nuclear fission reaction stops all by itself when the circulation pumps stop, so there's no need for control rods. In other words, they didn't just figure out how to eliminate the need to pressurize the reactor core, eliminating the risk of light water flashing to steam in case of depressurization, or worse yet, separating into an explosive mixture of hydrogen and oxygen. They also figured out an incredibly innovative way to completely eliminate any possibility of a fuel rod meltdown occurring in the first place, because they eliminated the fuel rods. Had the molten salt reactor been adopted as the industry standard when it was first proven in the 1960s, these safety innovations could have prevented the Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima accidents. But there was one very, very serious problem with the molten salt reactor, which led to its demise in 1971. Molten salt moderated nuclear reactors were developed in Tennessee, but President Nixon was a Californian. There was a competing experiment in California called the liquid metal fast breeder reactor. The liquid metal fast breeder reactor didn't offer any of the safety benefits I just described. But the liquid metal fast breeder reactor project was in the president's home state. The molten salt reactor experiment in Tennessee, which was doing groundbreaking work on nuclear reactor safety, was canceled, in large part because President Nixon and the power brokers running the Atomic Energy Commission at the time wanted the money spent in California instead. Now, I'm sure you probably think I sound like a crazed conspiracy theorist to make such an outlandish claim, but you don't have to take my word for it. If you're familiar with the Watergate scandal, you already know that President Nixon had an odd habit of tape recording himself at what would later turn out to be the most inopportune times. So let's listen in now to President Nixon's June 1971 phone call with Congressman Craig Hosmer, also from California.
Yeah.
Congressman Craig Hosmer, sir. Ready?
Hello.
Mr. President?
Since you missed our meeting when we had on Breeder Reactor, I wanted you to know that we sent the message today, Craig, but that I just told Ziegler to tell the press that it's a bipartisan effort that you and Hollifield and so forth had been bugging me about it. The one thing I wanted to tell you, too, is that Hollifield was there last night for the 8 Club thing. And I've told the people around here, now this has got to be something we play very close to the vest, but I am being ruthless on one thing. Any activities that we possibly can should be placed in Southern California, in this field, and also in the saline water field.
Good.
We need the jobs. We need to sop up those aircraft workers. Now, we're going to do a couple of new things on water, for example, and I've decided to throw one big plant into Southern California. I mean, a big one of these implementing, you know what I mean? It's just a question of how big the plant is. But in this energy field, I've told Dr. David and of course, Seaborg and the rest that we do it. So on the committee, every time you have a chance, needle them, say, where's this going to be? Let's push to California. You do that?
Incidentally, Mr. President, I'm so delighted you released that $16 million on the improvement of the enriching complex.
Good.
That handles a bad blood problem for us.
Right. Good.
Unplug some.
Well, they told me you were interested in it, and I said, well, if Hosmer's for it, I'm for it.
President Nixon made it quite clear in that call that Team California was ruthless and playing it close to the vest. And they were ultimately successful at keeping all the research money in their own state. The safety of our civilian nuclear power industry would pay the price for that political favoritism for the next 5 decades, and still counting. Breeder reactors will be a critically important part of our future, and I'll explain what they are and why they're so important in the next episode. But let's return to the molten salt reactor story now. By 1971, the scientists at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, who had already proven the benefits of molten salt as a coolant in a working reactor, were hard at work designing a molten salt breeder reactor that had numerous safety advantages over the Californian breeder reactor design. The Californians working on the fast breeder reactor had gone way over budget on their version of the breeder reactor, but at least that money was being spent in the president's home state. By September 7, 1972, testimony in a congressional hearing made it clear that cost overruns on the California fast breeder reactor project would cost the taxpayers at least $700 million, which was a lot of money in 1972. That's more than $5 billion in today's dollars. The molten salt reactor experiment in Oak Ridge, Tennessee was run by Alvin Weinberg, who was unsuccessfully trying to call attention to the profound advances in reactor safety that had just been achieved in the molten salt project. Weinberg's team had eliminated the risk of depressurization, steam flashing, and hydrogen explosions by eliminating the light water coolant, and they completely eliminated meltdown risk by dissolving the fuel in the molten salt coolant, eliminating the fuel rods completely. The liquid metal fast breeder reactor project in California was being run by Milton Shaw, who had a reputation for being ruthless in achieving his goals. The other man in a position of power and influence was Chet Hollifield, who President Nixon mentioned briefly in the call we just heard. Hollifield was a congressman from, you guessed it, California. Alvin Weinberg, father of the molten salt reactor design, would later write in his 1994 autobiography, quote, Congressman Chet Hollifield was clearly exasperated with me, and he finally blurted out, Alvin, if you're concerned about the safety of reactors, then I think it may be time for you to leave nuclear energy, end quote. Weinberg wrote that he was speechless. It was instantly clear that the powers that be were not interested in Weinberg's focus on making nuclear reactor safety the top priority, especially if the nuclear reactors in Tennessee were safer than those in California. Alvin Weinberg, the father of the molten salt reactor design, was fired. The molten salt reactor experiment at Oak Ridge was canceled completely in 1973, and Weinberg's reactor designs, which by the late 1960s had proven that the risks of fuel rod meltdowns and hydrogen explosions could be completely eliminated, were all but forgotten. In the decades that followed, reactors at Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, and several others would melt down in accidents that Weinberg's reactor designs could have prevented. The 3 Mile Island incident was a partial core meltdown accident due to loss of coolant, which never could have happened with Weinberg's molten salt designs. Then in 2011, hydrogen explosions that Weinberg's reactor designs could have prevented literally blew the roofs off the containment buildings at Fukushima Daiichi. Please ask yourself, is the problem really that nuclear energy is inherently unsafe? Or is the problem that our government hasn't done an ideal job of putting priority on what's most important to we the people? I think it's the latter. Weinberg's emphasis on designing safer nuclear reactors back in the 1960s was sacrificed for the sake of things far more important to the people running the Atomic Energy Commission than eliminating the risk of reactor meltdowns or preventing hydrogen explosions like the ones that blew the roofs off in Fukushima. They cared much more about which state federal research money would be spent in, and they didn't want competition upstaging their pet project, the liquid metal fast breeder reactor, which was being developed in Southern California. Milton Shaw and Chet Hollifield were, in President Nixon's own words, ruthless and playing it close to the vest. How thoughtful of them to record Craig Hosmer's phone call with President Nixon, so there can be no question as to what the real priorities of the Atomic Energy Commission were back in late 1971, when Alvin Weinberg was fired, and the stage was set for the Oak Ridge molten salt reactor experiment to be completely canceled 18 months later. The groundbreaking work on nuclear reactor safety done at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the 1960s would almost certainly have been forgotten forever, if not for the efforts of Kirk Sorensen, a NASA engineer who discovered the molten salt reactor project's research papers when he was trying to figure out how NASA might colonize the moon. A human colony on the moon would require power to operate, and Sorensen was at first fascinated by the possibility that a thorium-fueled molten salt reactor based on the Oak Ridge designs might provide the energy needed for a moon colony. Sorensen later realized that the work done at Oak Ridge in the 1960s could revolutionize how energy is produced right here on Earth. He would eventually leave NASA to become an outspoken proponent of thorium-fueled molten salt reactors and the founder of a company aspiring to build and commercialize them. All the research papers from the Oak Ridge experiments somehow found their way to a storage room in a rural children's museum just a few miles from the Oak Ridge Laboratory, where they were scheduled to be destroyed. Sorensen launched a one-man effort to save the records from Oak Ridge and managed to raise enough money to scan all the research documents just before they would otherwise have been lost forever. To this day, Kirk Sorensen is a leading advocate of thorium-fueled nuclear power, and his website, energyfromthorium.com, is well worth checking out if you want to learn more about the work done at Oak Ridge and the promise thorium offers as an alternative to uranium. I'll also address that topic in the next and final episode of this docuseries. Putting all of this in context, many of the things that can go wrong in a nuclear power plant are a result of using light water as the coolant and moderator in the reactor core. Better alternatives have been known for more than 50 years, but the vast majority of nuclear reactors in commercial operation around the globe are still light water moderated and cooled, as are the new reactors being built today. Back in 2012, when I first became aware of Kirk Sorensen's desire to commercialize the Oak Ridge designs, I reached out to the most knowledgeable and successful energy investors I know, seeking their advice. I asked them, is this Sorensen guy for real? Is this molten salt reactor idea really as compelling as he makes it out to be? Should I consider an angel investment in the company that he was launching at the time? My mentors all gave me the same answer. First, they said yes, Both molten salt and thorium-fueled reactors are just as exciting as Sorensen makes them out to be. But then in the very next breath, they told me I would be crazy to throw money away investing in them in 2012. They went on to explain that nuclear energy is the most regulated industry in existence. The government makes the rules, and they alone decide what technology will be commercialized. They said it was a real shame that the advanced designs pioneered by the Oak Ridge molten salt reactor experiment of the mid-1960s were never commercialized. But then they explained that it would never happen unless the government were in the driver's seat making it happen. My mentors explained that to lobby Congress to approve an advanced reactor design, never mind a new fuel like thorium, would be so expensive that it could never happen. The solutions to the problems of core meltdown, steam flashing of pressurized water cores, and hydrogen explosions are anything but new. Most of the operational safety and waste disposal problems the nuclear power industry has experienced to date could have been prevented by the advanced reactor designs Weinberg's team at Oak Ridge perfected way back in the 1960s. But that work was almost completely forgotten, quite literally because it happened in the wrong state. Now things are finally starting to turn around for the better, at least on a small scale. On April 12, 2021, the United States Department of Energy, Office of Nuclear Energy, issued a flyer titled 3 Advanced Reactor Systems to Watch by 2030. The 3 designs they described in that paper are the sodium-cooled fast reactor, the very high-temperature reactor, and the molten salt reactor. That's right, the last one on their list is the very same molten salt reactor design which was built, tested, and proven by Alvin Weinberg's team at Oak Ridge in the 1960s, just before Weinberg was fired by California Congressman Chet Holifield and Atomic Energy Commission honcho Milton Shaw for making the outrageous statement that safety should be the top priority in reactor design. Now, more than half a century later, the U.S. Department of Energy has finally declared in an official communication that the so-called new technology we should be keeping an eye on is exactly what Weinberg's team perfected in the 1960s. It's about time. An old saying in Washington goes, "Never let a crisis go to waste," because it's in times of crisis that the most progress can be made pushing through government bureaucracy and making important things happen. So as I became convinced in late 2021 that a global energy crisis was unavoidable for the reasons explained in the second episode of this docuseries, I decided to revisit the question of investing in advanced nuclear technology. I learned that there are already several startups working right now on molten salt reactors, thorium-fueled reactors, and several other exciting advanced nuclear technologies. Almost all these startups are the pet projects of billionaires who have so much money that they don't mind taking irrational investment risks, building a reactor that governments might never even allow to be turned on, because that reactor's design is miles ahead of anything the regulators are equipped to regulate. These guys are so passionate about inventing the technology that could save the world from the coming global energy crisis that they're willing to take an irrational investment risk to try and make it happen. For example, Microsoft founder Bill Gates has bankrolled an advanced nuclear project called the Natrium reactor. Several other startups are building molten salt-cooled and even thorium-fueled nuclear reactors, knowing full well that there isn't a country on Earth that will allow them to be turned on, because no regulatory precedent exists for operating that kind of commercial reactor. My strong suspicion is that the billionaires bankrolling these pet projects in advanced nuclear technology see exactly the same writing on the wall that I see. A global energy crisis beyond almost anyone's comprehension is coming, and coming soon. When it happens, being the guy who already built the advanced reactor that could save the world if only the government would allow it to be turned on is an awfully good look. Consider, for example, how governments fast-tracked COVID vaccines and threw outlandish sums of money at the companies that had plausible ideas for vaccine development in the hysteria of the pandemic. When you factor in the effect that the coming global energy crisis will have on the attitude of regulators, suddenly, investing in those crazy advanced reactor startups which are building reactors no country on Earth will permit operation of today doesn't sound nearly as irrational as it did when I first received the advice not to invest in this stuff well over a decade ago. It wasn't time yet back then, but now it's another story. Let's return now to the type of nuclear reactors that governments around the world already know how to regulate. Pressurized light water moderated reactors fueled by uranium, such as those built by Westinghouse, the company that designed and built most of today's operating fleet of commercial nuclear power plants. An issue of great concern to the anti-nuclear lobby is nuclear weapons proliferation. One of the biggest myths that we need to debunk is the idea that uranium fuel that powers nuclear reactors could somehow be used to make a nuclear bomb. It just plain doesn't work that way. To make a nuclear bomb, uranium must be enriched to at least 90% U-235, the specific isotope of uranium which is fissionable. Natural uranium mined from the ground contains only 0.7% U-235. To make the fuel for nuclear reactors, uranium is typically enriched to between 3% and 5% U-235. That low-enriched uranium has no value whatsoever in making a bomb, so this perceived risk is pure fiction. Now, that's not to say there are no bona fide weapons proliferation risks. To make the fuel for nuclear reactors, uranium is enriched by converting it into gaseous form and spinning it very fast in centrifuges which concentrate the U-235. Although the centrifuge facilities that are used to make nuclear fuel are typically not capable of making high-enriched uranium needed for nuclear weapons, an argument could be made that once a country has the centrifuges needed for making nuclear reactor fuel, it's possible to add more centrifuges and use them to produce weapons-grade uranium. Now, that's a legitimate concern, but please notice that the centrifuges aren't needed to operate nuclear reactors. They're only needed to make the fuel rods required to operate nuclear reactors. That means if you're concerned about weapons proliferation, it really doesn't make sense to concern yourself with which countries are allowed to operate nuclear reactors. The important question is where the fuel is made and who is in control of that process. Most of the weapons proliferation concerns can be overcome by restricting where the nuclear reactor fuel can be produced, rather than restricting where nuclear reactors can be operated to generate electricity. Breeder reactors also play a key role in this story, and I'll come back to that topic in the next episode. The next big objection to nuclear power is nuclear waste disposal. There's nearly 250,000 metric tons of high-level nuclear waste in storage worldwide. High-level nuclear waste consists almost entirely of spent nuclear fuel that was already used in nuclear power plants over the last 60 years. The reason so many people understandably freak out about nuclear waste is that some of the material stays radioactive for 100,000 years or longer. That's an awfully long time, but that statistic is misleading. The radioactive decay of spent nuclear fuel waste declines rapidly after just a few years. After it's been stored for just 50 years, 99% of the dangerous radioactive decay has already occurred. There are still materials in that spent fuel with half-lives upwards of 100,000 years, but the radiation is so small that it barely exceeds safe background radiation levels. Now, to be clear, I personally don't like the idea of any radioactive waste needing to be stored for 100,000 years, and I think the nuclear industry has in the past been too dismissive of this concern. But to keep it in perspective, the dangerous radiation really is done and over with after the first 50 years. And even during those first 50 years, high-level nuclear waste isn't nearly as dangerous as most people think. To make this point, the Dutch government built a single building which serves as both a nuclear waste storage facility and a children's science museum. Look at the big round circles in the floor in this picture. That's the floor of the Children's Science Museum. And those big round circles are the tops of the canisters in which spent fuel waste from their nuclear reactor is stored. The children are welcome to sit on top of the nuclear waste canisters just to prove to themselves and their parents that spent nuclear fuel waste isn't really the stuff of horror movies. When spent fuel comes out of a light water moderated reactor, 95% of that spent fuel material is perfectly good natural uranium. that can and should be recycled rather than left sitting in dry cask storage for 100,000 years. The process for recycling the spent nuclear fuel has already been proven and commercialized. So just going to the trouble of recycling spent nuclear fuel could reduce the amount of nuclear waste produced by today's nuclear industry by 95%. But wait, the story gets even better from here. The remaining 5% is some pretty nasty stuff called transuranics. Is it really better if we have to store concentrated nuclear waste for 100,000 years instead of storing a much larger volume of current generation nuclear waste for the same time period? I suppose there's some benefit to reducing the volume of waste material in storage, but that hardly solves the overall problem. But waste-burning breeder reactors do solve that problem, and they solve it in a beautiful way. They can actually burn the nuclear waste that's already been produced by the last 60-plus years of operating light water moderated reactors and use that waste as fuel. That's right, we already have the technology to take the nuclear waste we thought we were going to have to store for the next 100,000 years, recycle it instead, then reuse the 95% of it, which is perfectly good natural uranium, and then burn the rest of it as fuel in waste-burning breeder reactors. That means it's possible to have a nuclear renaissance that not only doesn't add any more nuclear waste to the 250,000 tons already in storage, we can actually burn the waste we already have as fuel and thus eliminate the need to store it long term. Remember, the reactor that Alvin Weinberg and his team were working on when he was fired in 1971 was a molten salt breeder reactor. So the technology needed to solve the nuclear waste problem was actually developed and almost completed in the United States half a century ago. It just happened in the wrong United State, and that's why it was abandoned. And there's still a catch. To this day, there's still no regulatory precedent for commercializing waste-burning breeder reactors. So the guys who already know how to build them are currently working for those advanced nuclear startups that tend to be the pet projects of billionaires, waiting, fingers crossed, for the day when governments finally get with the program. I'll tell you about one such company that's already leading the charge on waste-burning breeder reactors in the next and final episode of this docuseries. Until very recently, the government's performance in managing the nuclear power industry has been nothing short of abysmal. And I contend that's the real problem. Nuclear energy was never inherently unsafe. The problems began when our government fired Alvin Weinberg for the offense of making safety his team's top priority. Some of my friends in the nuclear industry are completely dismissive of the waste disposal problem, because the true risk posed by nuclear waste is minuscule in comparison to how the public perceives it. They have their facts right, but I still disagree. I don't care how small the safety risk is. I don't want to be part of leaving behind any radioactive waste that future generations have to contend with for 100,000 years. But I'm also convinced that the technology to solve that problem completely was already invented by the time I was old enough to ride a bicycle, and I'm in my late 50s now. Maybe it's time we start using that technology, which my parents' tax dollars paid to develop back in the 1960s. It's truly sad that it will probably take a global energy crisis punctuated by great human suffering for the government to finally get its act together and put to work the advanced nuclear technology that was invented when I was still in diapers. But at least we know from their 2021 pamphlet that the molten salt reactor is back on their radar screen. Hopefully, thorium will be next. I promised I wouldn't sugarcoat the problems with nuclear power, so we've already spent most of this episode on my critique of what needs to be improved. But let's step back now and put this picture in perspective. Nuclear power is already the safest form of baseload power generation in existence. Despite the shortcomings of pressurized light water reactors and the political favoritism that prevented much safer molten salt reactors from being commercialized, the fact remains that nuclear is already far safer than any other option we have. Nuclear is the only option that can realistically scale up to supply 180,000 terawatt-hours of new clean energy by 2050, without relying on technological advances that haven't happened yet, as is the case with supercritical geothermal. The light water reactors of today still produce nuclear waste, but the path is now clear for how the waste-burning breeder reactors of tomorrow will consume that waste as fuel. It's essential to understand that there haven't been any serious accidents in the nuclear power industry, except for those that were caused by human beings doing really stupid things they frankly should never have been allowed to do in the first place. In the case of Chernobyl, that reactor design would never have been permitted in the West to start with. Operators at the Chernobyl plant were trying to perform a safety test they had botched 3 times previously. They didn't bother to run their test plan past the reactor's designers or the nuclear regulator, despite that, among other things, their test plan involved intentionally disabling the emergency core cooling system while the reactor was running. That's the system designed to protect the core from meltdown in the event of a loss of coolant accident. So intentionally disabling it while the reactor was running was reckless, to say the very least. This safety test was scheduled during the day shift, but it went badly awry, resulting in an unplanned, near-total shutdown of the reactor. When they finally got the reactor back up and running on only partial power, well below the threshold their own written test plan called for, they still weren't even sure why the reactor had almost completely shut down. But despite having no idea why the reactor wasn't behaving as they expected it to, they decided to press on rather than abandoning their test. Just after midnight, the reactor was being operated by a 25-year-old night shift technician with 3 months' experience in his position. He made several very serious mistakes that would ultimately result in catastrophic failure of the reactor. The accident was 100% the result of human error. There was nothing wrong with the reactor, and no significant malfunction occurred. The problem was with the humans operating the reactor, whose reckless test plans and egregious operational errors directly caused the disaster. In the case of 3 Mile Island, when a loss of coolant accident occurred, automated safety systems turned on the emergency coolant pumps to protect the reactor core from meltdown. Human operators responded by overriding the automatic safety systems and turning the emergency coolant pumps back off. After misinterpreting the overall situation due to poor training, the operators had already convinced themselves that there was no loss of coolant, but they were dead wrong. They decided the emergency cooling system, which had activated automatically to prevent a meltdown, wasn't really needed, so they shut it off, and a partial core meltdown resulted. The meltdown could have been prevented had the operators not intervened to prevent the automated safety systems from doing the job they were designed to do. In the case of Fukushima Daiichi, tsunami-related safety recommendations were made but then ignored, not once, but twice, first in 2000 and then in 2008. Safety inspectors had informed the operator that the seawall wasn't high enough and recommended that it be extended to protect against a tsunami, but no action was taken. The diesel backup generators for the coolant system were originally located in the basement of the turbine building. Engineers from GE informed TEPCO, the operator of the plant, that this location was vulnerable to flooding and that the generators should be moved to higher ground. TEPCO responded by moving the generators to higher ground, while leaving all the electrical switching equipment for connecting the generators to the cooling pumps in the basement, where it was predictably flooded by the tsunami, rendering the generators on higher ground completely useless. Regulators ultimately ruled that even with the extent of damage from the tsunami, the entire nuclear disaster could easily have been prevented had safety recommendations been heeded. There was no unforeseeable freak of nature. The exact scenario of a tsunami hitting the plant and resulting in flood damage, disabling the emergency backup power for the coolant circulation pumps, was fully understood and anticipated by safety inspectors who informed the plant operator in writing exactly what needed to be done to mitigate those exact risks years before the accident occurred. Those written instructions were ignored, not just once, but twice. So history is clear. The problem is not that nuclear energy is inherently unsafe. The problem is that human beings prone to doing stupid things should not be allowed to operate nuclear reactors. The solution is automation, and that solution is well within our current technological capability. The latest Generation 3 pressurized light water reactors have far more sophisticated automation and fail-safe systems than the reactors that melted down in 3 Mile Island and Fukushima. The state-of-the-art in nuclear energy safety could still be improved a whole lot more, as I explained in great detail earlier in this episode. But it's already the safest form of power generation in existence, and we should not hesitate to build more Generation 3 nuclear plants. Going forward, we need to design fully automated reactors, which don't rely on human operators at all, and which don't have big control rooms full of confusing instrumentation. The lesson we should learn is to design future reactors so that even Homer Simpson couldn't possibly cause a disaster by trying to interfere with the automated systems that are better equipped to handle an emergency than human decision makers who have repeatedly failed to perform under pressure. The final problem with nuclear power I want to address in this episode is the time horizon required to bring new nuclear power generation online at the scale we're going to need it. Sadly, large bespoke public works projects are something we're just not as good at as we once were. When the Golden Gate Bridge was completed in 1937, it took 4 years to build, start to finish, and it came in just under budget at $35 million, which is just over $700 million in today's dollars. A project is underway right now to add a suicide prevention net under that bridge. That's right, nothing more than a net strung up under the bridge to catch suicide jumpers. That project is now both over budget and late to finish. More than $400 million has already been spent. That's considerably more than half what it originally cost to build the entire bridge, even after adjusting for inflation. Just to add a net under a bridge that's already been built. And the incomplete project to add the safety net has already taken more than the 4 years that it took to build the entire bridge. We're just not as good at managing large public works construction projects and getting them done on time and on budget as we used to be. In the nuclear power industry, the same holds true today. Cost and schedule overruns at the Vogtle nuclear power plant construction project in Georgia literally bankrupt Westinghouse in 2017. And even back in the 1970s, we had the same problem. The reason that nuclear power never delivered on the promise of making electricity cheaper than it ever was before is that every nuclear power plant project ran massive cost overruns. And this is a really important point to understand. Nuclear power really is, and always has been, the cheapest way to generate baseload electricity when you measure the cost of operating the nuclear power plant. The problem is that when you also factor in the cost of building the power plant, including all those cost overruns, then the fully loaded cost of electricity is far higher than the direct operational cost of producing it. And that's the only reason that electricity produced in nuclear power plants isn't much cheaper than it is today. A personal friend of mine was a union construction worker who helped to build the Seabrook nuclear power plant in New Hampshire in the 1970s. And the stories of corruption and malfeasance, he told me, would knock your socks off. He said the running joke among the union workers was the day shift built the plant and the night shift tore it down. Safety rules meant to protect the public made the construction contractors immune from penalty if they detected quality problems and had to redo parts of the project. The contractors seized the opportunity to build the plant several times over, by intentionally allowing quality defects to occur, thus forcing reconstruction and horrendous cost overruns, which only made the contractors richer. My friend told me that, ironically, clowning around on the job site was actually more common at the nuclear plant than any other job site, because every union worker on the job knew that the first time they built anything, it was just going to be torn back down again and rebuilt, so that the contractors could gouge even more money by rebuilding it. And so long as they were paying union wages, the workers never complained. It's truly sad that our industrial capabilities have devolved to this level since World War II. But they have, and this leads me to the conclusion that large-scale nuclear power plants like Vogtle will always be plagued with cost and schedule overruns. I'm convinced that the only viable solution is to build nuclear reactors in factories on assembly lines. What Honda did for the quality and rapid production of automobiles needs to be done again, but this time to much more demanding nuclear safety quality standards. The reason I've become focused on small modular nuclear reactors built on assembly lines is not because they're inherently better than much larger conventional nuclear power plants. I'm not convinced they are. The reason I'm convinced that small modular reactors are the way of the future is that I still have confidence that we can manufacture them in factories on the scale we're going to need them. But sadly, I've lost faith in our ability to undertake large bespoke public works projects without screwing them up. The cost and schedule overruns at the Vogtle power plant in Georgia, which bankrupted Westinghouse in 2017, stand as evidence to my point. I'm convinced that nuclear power can and should be the primary solution to the coming global energy crisis, unless a major breakthrough in supercritical deep geothermal energy changes the game. The reason I favor nuclear power is that it's the only option we have that can be scaled up to produce 160 to 180,000 terawatt hours of thermal energy that we need to fully replace fossil fuels. But I want to be honest about the sadly unavoidable reality of nuclear power, which is that it will take well over a decade to roll out at the scale we're going to need it. That means the sooner we get serious about this energy transition and prioritize a nuclear renaissance, the better. And it also means we're going to have to invest in keeping the oil and gas industry not just alive, but growing for at least another decade. It's true that rolling out nuclear will take more than a full decade, but the real conclusion to be drawn there is simply that we should have started doing so at least a full decade ago. We're late to get serious about this energy transition, and time is of the essence to put real plans in place that can deliver all the energy needed to replace fossil fuels. The only option for adding more nuclear-powered electricity generation right now is to build more conventional nuclear power plants using already licensed light-water moderated reactor designs like the Westinghouse AP1000. But the minimum time for commissioning a new power plant construction project to delivering electricity into the grid is at least 7 years, and more likely 10+ years by the time all is said and done. Without significant new investment in oil exploration and production, petroleum prices will rise to economy-crippling levels long before enough new nuclear power plants can be built to fully solve the problem. It's easy for a futurist like myself to produce a docuseries like this one, singing the praises of modular nuclear reactors built on assembly lines, based on molten salt, thorium fuel, fast breeder reactor technology, and all these other advances which I'll discuss in the next episode. But as passionate as I might be about such things, the fact remains that there isn't a country on Earth that's ready to permit the operation of a molten salt reactor, never mind a thorium-fueled commercial reactor. We desperately need to move past light water reactors and commercialize the even safer advanced nuclear technology that was invented while I was still just a toddler. But until we do, building more Generation 3 pressurized light water reactor power plants is the best option we have. Governments are notoriously slow to change until a crisis forces them to. Then they tend to act impulsively without enough thought. My primary motive for producing this docuseries was to promote public understanding of these issues so that when the mid-2020s energy crisis hits the public stage, that crisis doesn't go to waste. We need to use that crisis to push through a top-level policy directive to embrace nuclear energy as the primary strategy to achieve net zero policy objectives by 2050. It's taken this entire episode just to explain what's wrong with the current nuclear power industry. In the next and final episode of this docuseries, we'll focus on solutions, introduce some really exciting advanced nuclear technology, and I'll lay out my plan for solving the coming global energy crisis using a combination of nuclear power, existing renewable sources like wind and solar, geothermal energy, and yes, by extending the life of the oil and gas industry for at least another decade until we can phase in viable clean alternatives needed to eventually phase out fossil fuels completely. I hope you enjoyed the next episode of my new docuseries project. Please do not promote this project on social media quite yet. Let's keep this inside the Macro Voices community until the video version is ready for widespread consumption on YouTube. There are two areas where I need help finding the right partners for this project. The first production will be a low-budget YouTube series featuring my voice as narrator. I need to hire an experienced YouTuber to tell the story of my narration visually in a series of graphs, charts, still images, and video clips. Specifically, I'm looking for the kind of creative talent that knows how to tell that story on their own. I don't want to give them exact charts and say, put this here and there. I want them to figure out what the best way to tell this story in pictures is and to source a lot of their own graphics and video clips in order to do that. Most of the best YouTubers seem to want to monetize their work by hosting it in their own monetized YouTube channel. And I'm completely fine with that, so long as I can also host it in the Macro Voices channel. The more views it gets, the better. The other place I need help is putting the word out that I'm looking to partner with well-qualified and experienced documentary producers who have the needed industry contacts and have the experience needed to pitch a broadcast quality version of this project to Netflix and the other streaming services, get it funded, and then produce it to their specifications. I have a few ideas on this front, ranging from a normal documentary format to more of a Hollywood movie where the protagonist is a 20-something Just Stop Oil activist who discovers through the course of the film, in their own way, that most of the environmental beliefs that they had begun with were actually shaped more by emotion and rhetoric than logic and reason, so that by the end of the movie they become a pro-nuclear environmentalist, pushing for a future fueled by thorium. But I need to collaborate with experienced documentary directors and producers to really figure out the best way to get this message across to the masses. A few of you have already suggested documentary directors that I should contact, and I'm already working those leads. If anyone listening works in Hollywood or knows the right people to make a project like this happen, please feel free to refer them to www.macrovoices.com/energydoc, where they can find a draft.pdf treatment for the broadcast version. For now, my plan is to focus most of my energy on self-producing the low-budget YouTube version, and the main resource I need for that project is the help of a talented, experienced YouTuber who's passionate about the subject matter and who's good at telling stories visually through charts, images, video clips, and so forth over my narration. I continue to welcome your suggestions on who I should be reaching out to for help with this part of the project, and I've already begun reaching out to some of the YouTubers that a few of you already recommended in your feedback after the first episode. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you enjoy this docuseries. I'm really excited about it.
That concludes this edition of Macro Voices. Be sure to tune in each week to hear feature interviews with the brightest minds in finance and macroeconomics. Please register your free account at www.macrovoices.com. Once registered, you'll receive our free weekly Research Roundup email containing links to supporting documents from our featured guests and the very best free financial content our volunteer research team could find on the internet each week. For more information, visit macrovoices.com.